The night Eleanor Whitford vanished, Newport shimmered under the weight of wealth and deceit. The grand mansions along Bellevue Avenue flickered with candlelight, their mirrored halls alive with laughter and whispered gossip. At the center of it all stood Eleanor, the darling of high society, elegant, adored, and, as many whispered when the champagne flowed, dangerously ambitious. That midsummer evening of 1889 was meant to be her triumph, the night she reminded Newport's finest that even scandal could not dull her charm. Yet, as dawn broke over the Atlantic, her silken slippers sat abandoned on the steps of her estate, and Eleanor was gone. By morning, carriages lined the cobblestone drive, their occupants whispering her name as if afraid it might summon her ghost. Servants spoke of strange noises from the forest beyond the Whitford property, rustling leaves when no wind blew, a faint melody drifting from the hollow, and once, the unmistakable echo of laughter. The police scoured the grounds, their boots sinking into the dew-soaked earth, but the trail led only toward the dark tangle of trees the locals called Whispering Hollow, a place avoided after sunset. Eleanor's husband, Charles Whitford, stood on the veranda with a cigar untouched between his fingers, eyes fixed on the woods as if something there was watching back. When questioned, his answers were measured, polite, too calm for a man whose wife had disappeared without a trace. But it was the butler's quiet confession that chilled the air. He had seen a figure cloaked in white slip through the garden gate after midnight, her gown trailing like mist, moving toward the forest. What followed were nights of unease, candlelight seen flickering deep within the trees, strange symbols carved into bark, and whispers among Newport's elite that Eleanor's fate was not merely tragic but deliberate. Some said she ran away to escape disgrace, others swore she had been claimed by something older, something that dwelled in the woods long before the Whitfords ever built their mansion there. Whatever truth the forest held, it remained hidden, waiting for the right night, and the right eyes, to see it. In the summer of 1889, Newport, Rhode Island, stood as the glittering crown of America's Gilded Age, a sanctuary for wealth, vanity, and secrets disguised beneath layers of silk and champagne. Among its highborn residents, none shone brighter than Eleanor Whitford, a socialite whose beauty and elegance had captivated every salon and drawing room from New York to Boston. She was known for her sharp wit, her daring fashions, and her uncanny ability to host soirees that left the city humming with admiration. But on the evening of her midsummer ball, an event meant to re-establish her status after months of whispered scandals, Eleanor's perfect image began to fracture. Guests arrived at the Whitford estate, a sprawling mansion perched along the cliffs, where music swelled through the air and torches flickered against the marble terraces. It was said that the sea breeze carried the scent of lilac and salt that night, mingling with the murmur of gossip and envy. Yet, beneath the laughter and sparkle, there lingered a tension no one could name. As midnight neared, Eleanor was last seen gliding across the ballroom floor in a gown the color of moonlight, her diamonds catching every flicker of the chandeliers. She exchanged polite words with guests, her smile as radiant as ever, though several noticed a restlessness in her eyes, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. One guest, a visiting English diplomat, later recalled how she kept glancing toward the tall glass doors that opened to the garden, where the shadows of the trees swayed under a rising wind. Sometime after 1 o'clock, as the orchestra played a final waltz, Eleanor excused herself and disappeared down the corridor leading toward the garden veranda. That was the last anyone saw of her. When morning arrived, the servants discovered her slippers resting neatly on the front steps, one glove dropped nearby, faintly stained with something dark. Her carriage remained in the stables, her jewelry box unopened, her bed unslept in. The ball gowns of the night before still hung in the dressing room, one shoulder strap torn as if hastily removed. Her husband, Charles Whitford, claimed she had gone to visit her sister in Providence, but no such visit was ever confirmed. The town awoke to the scandal of the century. A woman adored and envied by all, vanished into the night without witness or reason. The newspapers called it a mystery, her friends whispered it was punishment for pride, and the servants, trembling, spoke of the forest beyond the estate, where strange lights had flickered until dawn. Eleanor Whitford's disappearance could not have come at a more precarious time for her family. Beneath the polished veneer of their wealth, the Whitfords were teetering on the edge of financial and social ruin. Newport's elite had long suspected that Charles Whitford's shipping empire was not as prosperous as it appeared. Whispers of unpaid debts and failed ventures had begun to circulate through the gilded parlors where fortunes were discussed like gossip, and the summer ball that Eleanor hosted was intended to silence those murmurs with spectacle and elegance. Yet, as the music echoed through the marble halls that evening, certain guests noted a tension between husband and wife, a fleeting coldness in Charles's eyes and a forced brightness in Eleanor's laughter. What the public did not know was that their empire was drowning, and Eleanor herself was entangled in a private scandal that could have destroyed them both. Rumors hinted at an affair between Eleanor and a young painter, a man of humble birth whom she had commissioned to capture her portrait earlier that spring. Servants had overheard arguments behind closed doors, and one footman even claimed to have seen the artist leaving through the servants' gate late at night. For a woman of her standing, such a rumor was not merely scandalous, it was catastrophic. Newport society, so quick to adore, was equally eager to devour its own, and Eleanor knew that her reputation was her only true currency. Still, those close to her said she had grown distant in the weeks before her disappearance, more contemplative, as though burdened by a secret that neither pride nor beauty could conceal. The gossip deepened when, after her vanishing, letters were discovered in her writing desk, letters written in her hand but unsigned, speaking of betrayal, fear, and the desire to escape the cage of appearances. Her husband dismissed them as drafts for fiction, but the words carried the tremor of truth. They hinted that Eleanor feared being exposed, not only for her affair but also for her knowledge of something darker within her husband's business dealings, documents and shipments that never appeared in the ledgers, names of men who were not meant to be known. Some speculated that her disappearance was a desperate flight from disgrace, others believed she had been silenced before she could reveal what she knew. In the weeks that followed, Newport salons buzzed with theories, each more sinister than the last, but what none could deny was that the glittering world the Whitfords had built was crumbling, and Eleanor's absence had turned its decay into a haunting spectacle. 3 days after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, the search that had gripped Newport took a darker turn when a bloodstained glove was discovered near the edge of the forest bordering the Whitford estate, a place locals called Whispering Hollow. The glove, delicate and ivory in color, was recognized instantly as belonging to Eleanor. It matched the pair she had been wearing on the night of her midsummer ball. A gardener found it at dawn, half buried beneath a layer of damp leaves, as if the forest itself had tried to conceal it. The small, rust-colored stain on the lace was unmistakable, and when word spread, the discovery transformed a vanishing into something far more sinister. What had been whispered as a scandal or an elopement was now spoken of as possible violence. The police arrived within hours, cordoning off the area and combing through the underbrush for any trace of footprints, torn fabric, or blood, but the forest seemed to swallow every clue. The locals, already uneasy about the woods, murmured that Whispering Hollow had always been cursed. Generations earlier, it was said that a small settlement had burned to the ground there, its survivors driven mad by what they had seen in the trees. Children were told not to wander near it after dusk, and hunters claimed to hear voices calling their names deep within its shadows. For Eleanor's glove to be found at its border felt like an omen, a sign that whatever had happened to her did not end within the civilized boundaries of her estate but had spilled into the realm of something untamed and ancient. Detectives questioned the servants again, hoping to find a connection between the glove and the events of that night. One maid recalled hearing the sound of hurried footsteps near the veranda long after the final guests had left, followed by a faint cry that was quickly swallowed by the wind. Another spoke of seeing light flickering through the trees, a lantern, perhaps, or something else. Charles Whitford maintained his composure, insisting that his wife must have wandered off in distress, though the blood on the glove suggested otherwise. Still, without a body, the investigation faltered, and the authorities hesitated to accuse a man of such standing without proof. As days turned to weeks, the glove remained locked in an evidence drawer at the police station, the only tangible link to the vanished socialite. But even as official searches dwindled, townsfolk continued to report strange sounds from the hollow, soft laughter carried by the wind, the faint shimmer of white fabric between the trees, and the unsettling sense that Eleanor Whitford was not gone at all, but waiting just beyond the edge of sight. As the days passed after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, the townspeople of Newport grew restless, and the once celebrated Whitford estate began to draw an air of dread. It was the servants who spoke first, in hushed voices and trembling tones, of the strange things they had begun to witness near the edge of the property, where the forest known as Whispering Hollow pressed against the gardens. On the third night after the discovery of Eleanor's blood-stained glove, the housemaid claimed to have seen a flicker of light moving through the trees, soft, unsteady, as though someone were carrying a candle far into the woods. Thinking it might be one of the searchers, she watched from her attic window, but what unsettled her was how the light seemed to move in deliberate patterns, weaving among the trees before vanishing altogether. When she told the others, they dismissed it as her imagination, but before long, more servants began to report similar sights. By the end of that week, several of them swore they had heard laughter drifting from the forest long after midnight, a woman's laughter, light and musical, though faint and distant, echoing as if carried on the wind. The cook refused to step outside after sunset, and the stable boy claimed he had seen a white shape gliding between the trunks, pale as moonlight, before disappearing into the shadows. The air around Whispering Hollow grew heavy with unease. Even the dogs, once loyal and fierce, now whined and refused to approach the tree-line. Charles Whitford, growing increasingly irritated by the rumors, ordered the staff to remain silent and forbade anyone from speaking of nonsense and superstition. Yet his own behavior began to betray cracks. He was seen pacing the veranda in the small hours, staring toward the forest with a face pale and drawn, as if expecting something to emerge from it. When the police conducted another search, they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of campfires, no evidence that anyone had entered the woods. Still, the stories continued. The neighbors claimed to see light through the trees on nights when the moon was full, and some said they heard music faintly, the echo of a waltz from the night of the ball. It was as though the forest itself had absorbed the memory of Eleanor's final evening, replaying it in fragments for those who dared to listen. Whether it was grief, guilt, or something far older that haunted the hollow, no one could say, but the servants whispered that the laughter they heard was not meant for them. It was a call, soft and beckoning, from someone who no longer belonged to the living. As the search for Eleanor Whitford stretched into its second week, suspicion began to turn toward the one man who seemed both most affected and least unsettled by her disappearance, her husband, Charles Whitford. At first, society was sympathetic, painting him as a tragic figure, a husband enduring unbearable loss while fending off gossip and speculation. But those who spent time in his company soon noticed inconsistencies in his account of the night Eleanor vanished. He told police he had retired early, claiming exhaustion after entertaining hundreds of guests, yet several witnesses recalled seeing him near the garden after midnight, his demeanor tense and distracted. One servant even testified to hearing raised voices from the direction of the veranda, though she could not make out the words. When pressed about these details, Charles grew defensive, his answers curt and precise, as though carefully rehearsed. Rumors that had once targeted Eleanor now shifted toward him. His business troubles had worsened in recent months, and his marriage, though enviable in public, had reportedly been strained behind closed doors. The discovery of the blood-stained glove only deepened the shadow over his reputation, for it had been found not far from the hunting path he often used. Detectives began to quietly question whether Eleanor's disappearance had been an act of desperation or something far more deliberate. In a town as tightly knit and image-conscious as Newport, the idea that one of its most respected men might have harmed his wife was unthinkable, and yet, beneath the surface, many began to believe it. Charles tried to maintain normalcy, hosting business associates at his estate and attending church with a composure that bordered on eerie detachment. But cracks began to show. Servants whispered that he spent long hours in his study, drinking heavily and burning letters in the fireplace. Late one evening, a groundskeeper claimed to see him walking toward Whispering Hollow with a lantern, disappearing among the trees for nearly an hour before returning empty-handed. When questioned, Charles dismissed the account as nonsense, insisting he had been searching for any trace of his wife. Yet, as days passed and no clues emerged, even the police began to suspect that his efforts were less about finding Eleanor and more about hiding something. The turning point came when a private investigator, hired by Eleanor's cousin, uncovered discrepancies in Charles's business records, transactions tied to a mysterious third party and sums large enough to suggest blackmail or bribery. Suddenly, his calmness no longer seemed dignified but calculated. To some, it was guilt in disguise, to others, it was fear not of exposure, but of something waiting in the woods that still whispered her name. Weeks after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, the police had little to show for their efforts: no body, no witnesses, only fragments of rumor and unease. Then, during a quiet afternoon inspection of the Whitford estate, one of the maids made a startling discovery. While cleaning Eleanor's dressing room, she noticed that the paneling near the vanity mirror was slightly uneven, the wood pulled just enough to reveal a narrow gap. Curious, she pried it open and found a small, leather-bound diary tucked behind the wall. Its cover was worn and its pages filled with Eleanor's delicate handwriting, the ink smudged in places as if written in haste. When the diary was handed to investigators, it became the most significant clue in the case, one that hinted that Eleanor's disappearance had not been an accident or flight of passion, but something much more deliberate and fearful. The first entries were typical of her life: descriptions of dinners, guests, and the endless demands of maintaining her social image. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. Eleanor wrote of sleepless nights, of feeling watched even within her own home, and of hearing faint sounds outside her window when the rest of the house slept. "There is someone in the garden," one entry read, dated just a week before the ball. "I see the shadow against the hedge at night, and though I tell Charles, he only laughs." Another passage revealed her growing paranoia about letters she had received from an unknown sender, letters that contained fragments of personal conversations, words only she and her husband could have known. She wondered if someone close to her was using her secrets against her, and she wrote of her fear that she would vanish before the truth could be spoken aloud. The final pages were the most chilling. Her handwriting became unsteady, the sentences shorter, the tone urgent. She described finding one of the mysterious letters placed on her vanity, even though her chamber door had been locked from the inside. She wrote of seeing a figure standing at the edge of the woods near midnight, its face obscured but its presence unmistakable. "They want me silent," she scrawled on the last page, the ink blotted by a tear or perhaps something darker. "If I disappear, it is not of my own will." After that, the diary ended abruptly, leaving investigators to speculate whether Eleanor had been warning someone, or confessing to knowledge of something dangerous. When Charles was asked about it, he dismissed the diary as hysteria, claiming his wife had grown unstable. Yet those who read her words felt something genuine in her terror, as if she had glimpsed a truth no one else was meant to see. The discovery of Eleanor Whitford's diary ignited fresh interest in the case, leading investigators to focus on the one place that appeared repeatedly in her writings, Whispering Hollow. The forest had always carried an air of superstition among the townspeople, but now it was viewed not merely as eerie, but as integral to the mystery surrounding her disappearance. When searchers returned to its depths with renewed determination, they stumbled upon something far stranger than footprints or discarded clothing. Etched into the trunks of several trees near the center of the hollow were strange symbols, circles intersected by lines, shapes resembling eyes, and markings that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Though weathered, they were unmistakably human-made, cut deep into the bark as if carved with a blade. The investigators could not decipher them, but one of the older townsfolk recognized the markings as similar to those found on the ruins of an abandoned chapel that had burned decades earlier. Those ruins, according to local legend, were once used by a secret gathering of Newport's wealthiest families, who practiced obscure rituals meant to secure fortune and influence. Rumors spread quickly that these carvings linked the Whitfords and their peers to something long buried beneath the town's gilded facade. It was said that Whispering Hollow had been the site of private ceremonies, held under moonlight, where oaths were sworn not to God but to whatever unseen forces promised prosperity. Some claimed these rituals required a symbolic offering, often something, or someone, of great value. While most dismissed such stories as superstition, the idea that the carvings might connect Eleanor's disappearance to these gatherings unsettled even the most skeptical. The police avoided addressing such claims publicly, yet the lead investigator, Captain Monroe, privately admitted that the precision of the carvings and their proximity to where Eleanor's glove was found could not be ignored. As word spread, locals began to visit the forest in secret, hoping to see the symbols for themselves. Many returned shaken, claiming that the air around the carvings felt unnaturally cold and that the forest grew silent as they approached. One young man insisted he saw faint candlelight flickering among the trees, though no trace of fire could be found the next morning. For Newport society, it was easier to laugh off the notion of occult practices than to confront the idea that their own were involved. But Eleanor's diary, the carvings, and the whispers of ritual all began to form a chilling pattern. It was no longer simply a tale of a vanished woman, it was a suggestion that she had uncovered a secret the town had buried for generations, and that her disappearance was not just a tragedy, but a warning written in symbols only the forest could keep. Several weeks after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, when the town had begun to drift uneasily back into its daily rhythm, a story emerged that reignited the entire mystery. It came from a child, Thomas Green, the 9-year-old son of a fisherman who lived near the cliffs. One fog-laden morning, he ran breathlessly into town claiming he had seen a lady in white walking along the forest trail that led into Whispering Hollow. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as a child's fancy, born of overheard gossip and fearful imagination. But Thomas insisted, describing the woman in uncanny detail, her long gown shimmering like frost, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and her bare feet leaving no mark on the muddy path. What unsettled the adults most was his mention of her face, pale, serene, and familiar from the portraits that hung in the Whitford mansion. He swore the lady had turned to look at him before vanishing into the trees, her lips moving as though she were whispering his name. The boy's father forbade him from going near the forest again, but the story spread quickly, stirring old fears. Within days, others began to claim their own sightings. A milkman driving before dawn reported seeing a figure standing at the edge of the road, motionless, staring toward the estate. A maid walking home from the harbor spoke of hearing the faint rustle of silk behind her, followed by a woman's laugh so soft it barely rose above the wind. Even those who had never believed in hauntings began to wonder if Eleanor's spirit lingered in the hollow, drawn to the place where her life, or perhaps something more sinister, had ended. For the investigators, the tale of the lady in white complicated everything. If it was merely superstition, it risked distracting from the tangible evidence still being sought. But those who had read Eleanor's diary could not ignore the eerie parallels. She had written about seeing someone watching her from the woods, a figure that mirrored the very apparition now described by the boy. Some theorized that Eleanor had fled and was hiding in plain sight, her ghostly appearances nothing more than misidentifications in the fog. Others whispered that she had never left the forest at all, that what people saw was not her living body, but something that remained bound to the place. As nights grew longer and mist rolled heavier over Newport's cliffs, the line between rumor and reality blurred. The image of the lady in white walking beneath the whispering branches became part of the town's silence, a haunting reminder that Eleanor Whitford might not be gone, only waiting in the shadows, where the living rarely dared to look. Months after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, when the gossip had dulled but the unease still lingered, a new clue surfaced that reignited the investigation and deepened the mystery. A group of woodsmen working several miles into Whispering Hollow stumbled upon an old hunting cabin, hidden beneath a canopy of moss and tangled vines. The structure was small, its roof sagging and its windows blackened by age, but what caught their attention was the faint metallic smell that hung in the air, a mix of rust and something darker. When they forced the door open, dust spiraled upward, and the silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin appeared abandoned for years, its furniture covered in decay. Yet in one corner lay something that did not belong to time, a torn fragment of satin fabric, pale and shimmering even in the dim light. When one of the men picked it up, he recognized it instantly as the same material described in newspapers, the gown Eleanor Whitford had worn on the night she vanished. The discovery sent shockwaves through Newport. Authorities arrived the following morning, their boots crunching over the damp forest floor, and began a meticulous search of the cabin and its surroundings. They found no sign of a struggle, no trace of a body, but the presence of that single piece of torn gown raised impossible questions. How had it reached so deep into the forest, miles from the estate? Some speculated that Eleanor had fled there herself, perhaps seeking refuge from someone or something she feared. Others whispered that she had been brought there against her will, that the cabin had served as a place of confinement, or worse. On the floor beneath the broken window, investigators noticed faint scuff marks, as though furniture had been dragged or someone had struggled to move within the cramped space. Theories multiplied overnight. Some believed Charles Whitford knew of the cabin, having used it years earlier for hunting trips and private gatherings. Others pointed to the strange symbols found carved into the nearby trees, identical to those deeper in the hollow, suggesting that the site held ritual significance. One constable swore he heard faint music as the search team prepared to leave, a single haunting note carried through the trees before fading into silence. Though the evidence was inconclusive, the fragment of Eleanor's gown became the most tangible link to her fate since the blood-stained glove. The cabin, once forgotten by time, now stood as a silent witness to whatever had transpired that night. And as investigators left, the forest seemed to close in again, erasing their presence, as if determined to keep its secret buried a little longer. Decades after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, the Whitford estate had fallen into quiet decay. The once grand halls were empty, the marble floors dulled, and the gardens that had once hosted Newport's most elegant parties now lay overgrown with ivy and wild roses. In the summer of 1923, the property was purchased by a Boston couple intent on restoring it to its former glory. During the renovations, while gardeners worked to reclaim the sunken grounds behind the house, they unearthed something that would stir the long-dormant whispers of the past, a large, rusted trunk buried beneath the soil of the south garden, only a few feet from the old fountain where Eleanor had been photographed in her youth. The trunk was sealed tight, its hinges corroded and its lock fused with age. When it was pried open, the workers stepped back in horror at what they found inside. Wrapped in layers of decayed cloth were personal items unmistakably belonging to Eleanor Whitford, a jeweled hair comb, a silver hand mirror engraved with her initials, and a set of letters bound with ribbon that had long since turned to dust. Beneath them, half hidden beneath scraps of silk and paper, was a single white shoe, the mate to the one found on the steps the morning she vanished. The discovery drew immediate attention from the authorities, though most of those who had investigated her disappearance were long dead. The new police chief, determined to put an end to Newport's oldest mystery, reopened the case. The letters, though largely destroyed by time, contained fragments still legible enough to suggest something dark. They referred to the debt owed, the night in the hollow, and the silence that must never be broken. These words rekindled the theory that Eleanor had uncovered secrets about her husband's dealings and the strange gatherings held in the woods, secrets that had cost her her life. When investigators examined the trunk more closely, they found traces of wax along the inner seams, melted remnants of candles, possibly from a ritual sealing rather than a burial. It was as if the trunk had been hidden not to preserve evidence, but to contain it. The trunk's discovery brought renewed unease to the town. Some claimed to see a woman's figure standing by the fountain in the evenings after, her reflection glimmering faintly in the cracked stone basin. Others swore that faint music played through the garden on windless nights. Whether the trunk held the truth or merely another piece of the elaborate riddle, it became clear that the past had not rested easily. The forest, the mansion, and now the earth itself seemed bound to Eleanor's story, a tale of beauty, betrayal, and silence that time had failed to bury completely.